Good morning and welcome to this 10th meeting of 2015 of the European and External Relations Committee. Can I make the usual request that mobile phones and electronic devices are switched off or on airplane mode? We've got quite a good agenda this morning, and we've always got a good agenda, but a busy agenda this morning. So agenda item 1 is decision on taking agenda item 3 in private, which is discussion on our deliberations this morning. Agreed. That agreed? So agenda item 2 is a new topic for us. It's the UK's future relationship with the EU. On the back of the announcement last week that there will be an in-and-out referendum, who said this committee wasn't reactive and topical. So we are delighted to have with us this morning, back with us, Professor Michael Keating, who's a Professor of Politics at the University of Aberdeen and the Director of the ESRC Centre in Constitutional Change. Our erstwhile advisor on the White Paper, Dr Daniel Keneally, who's a lecturer at the University of Edinburgh Academy of Government, and with us for the first time, and welcome, David Frost, who's the CEO of the Scotch Whisky Association and a former diplomat. Good morning to you all, gentlemen. We're delighted to have you here this morning to open up discussions on this very interesting and an exciting topic. What I wanted to do was to give you all, and can I thank you for the written evidence you've given us, but to give you all just a few moments each, maybe to not so much a formal opening statement, but a few moments each to explain your thoughts and feelings on the impact on Scotland of the in-and-out referendum. And I'm happy to start with whoever's first to open their mouth.
Since my first appearance, thank you, convener, and thank you for asking me to come. Could I just say briefly before beginning that if I have something relevant to say for this committee, I think it's probably primarily because of my experience as a diplomat, and in particular as the Foreign Office's EU director a few years back, and as the lead trade negotiator for the UK till 18 months ago. So please take my remarks as drawing on that experience and in that personal capacity. And obviously, where I'm representing an SWA position, I'll make that clear. But I think you can take it that the SWA is a strong supporter of EU membership and the trade benefits that come with that. Could I just say perhaps three things very briefly? What are the key issues for reform and the referendum? I think first it's the UK's national interest to stay part of the EU. We benefit economically from it very much. So I think the key issue is how does the government put itself in a position to win that referendum and keep those benefits. Second, I would say this is a big opportunity as well as an important moment. The UK has probably not been amazingly comfortable in the EU over the years. There's been more domestic political tension here than in other member states. And I think the big prize for the government is, can it settle that? Can it enable us to be a comfortable EU member going forward? And finally, I think this uncomfortableness is reflected in the polling. The majority for staying in is kind of thin and ambiguous. The majority for staying in a reformed EU is really quite strong, according to the polling. And I think so the PM's task, I guess, is how to convince people, how to persuade them, and how to get real reform and convince them that something significant has changed. So he's got to carry off, I think, the difficult task of bidding high enough to convince that there's been change and to get it low enough to make it negotiable. And I guess that's what he's trying to do at the moment in this first round of contacts. And at the European Council later this month, we'll find out where the opening pitch is.
Thank you. Professor.
Yes, well, I should say, first of all, that within our centre, we've got a line of research that is looking at this. Over the next year, we'll be looking in some depth at the European debate, the prospects for the referendum, and particularly the impact on the devolved territories of all of this. At the moment, picking up with what David said just in his last remark, it's very difficult to know where to begin, because it's not at all clear to me exactly what the UK's negotiating position is, other than there will be negotiations and there will be a referendum at the conclusion. The UK government has been very clear it wants to keep the single market, but it wants some kinds of reforms within the more general apparatus, decision-making apparatus and policy competences of the European Union. The problem is that the single market more or less drives everything. And this became apparent when the UK government had its balance of competence review. This was between 2012 and this year. There were 32 studies looking at various aspects of the European Union. lots of evidence, some very interesting work done, some very interesting analysis, but they didn't really find any competencies that could be appropriately repatriated to the United Kingdom, or where there was a serious problem, or competencies that could indeed be detached from the logic of the single market. Now, that review of the balance of competencies is available on the web, but you have to dig and find it. I had to Google it this morning because it's not up front on the government's website. It's more or less just disappeared. And this is curious, but it does indicate that the government didn't really find anything seriously wrong with the relationship with the European Union that it could have used as the opening gambit in negotiations. So we've had various things coming out of this government and the previous coalition government, but mainly, of course, it's the Conservative Party who are concerned about this. There was talk about the social dimension of the European Union being excessive. At one point, they were talking about the social chapter, which doesn't actually exist because the social provisions nowadays are scattered throughout the treaties. But there is a concept of social Europe, which is mostly to do with labour market regulation and protection of rights at work, which is controversial because of its economic impact. That seems to have disappeared into the background now, or it's become simply an argument about regulation. Maybe there's excessive regulation in the European Union, and this is hampering competitiveness. And there's a certain amount of sympathy in other countries for that position there. But then the government focused on free movement of labour. Sometime last year, this became the central issue because of public concern about migration and opinion polls showing that there was a great deal more concern about migration in the UK than there was about the European Union itself, and about free movement of labour and the arrival of migrants, mainly from the new member states of Central and Eastern Europe. And this was perceived as a problem. Whether it is or not is another matter. But free movement of labour is itself one of the pillars of the single market. You can't just opt out of that and keep the other bits of it, the free movement of goods, services, and capital. So that then became an argument about welfare entitlements. Maybe our welfare entitlements are too generous. Maybe people are engaging in welfare tourism or migration. The review of balance of competences that looked at that didn't find any evidence that there was such a problem of abuse. But nevertheless, it's something that now is on the table. But it's not clear to me whether trying to curtail welfare benefits for EU migrants is about trying to deter migration, or it's about addressing a problem of welfare abuse. And we really need to decide which it is before thinking what the appropriate remedy might be. We know that a lot of the welfare bill in this country is caused by the fact that we've got an economy with very high levels of unemployment but rather low wages. This is the development over the last few years. And these are topped up by lots of in-work benefits. That's a peculiarity of the British system. Low wages are compensated by in-work benefits and credits. And it's not quite clear how you can disentangle those from other questions to do with the labour market. So again, when it comes to welfare entitlements, we don't quite know what the issue is, and we need to decide what the issue is before we can examine what might be done about it. And then there's been some talk about protection of the United Kingdom from Eurozone rules. Since the UK opted out of the Euro, the Eurozone countries themselves started doing things themselves because they need to do certain things in common. That might have an impact on non-Eurozone countries. I'm not sure whether anything could be done about that, because the Eurozone countries are always free to do things outside the treaties. But nevertheless, that's something that the government has signalled. And then there's the question of whether treaty change would be required for whatever the outcome of the negotiation would be. And if treaty change is required, this creates all manner of complications, because not only would all the other 27 member states have to agree, but some of them would have to have referendums, and some of them would use the opportunity to put other things on the agenda. So I'd anticipate that the government would try and avoid treaty change, and the other member states would also, and that restricts how much you can do. Then, just briefly, as far as Scotland is concerned, there is a pro-European consensus amongst political parties and civil society generally in Scotland, stronger than there is in England. Public opinion is slightly less Eurosceptic here, but consistently so. The Scottish Government has adopted a different position on migration, saying that it's not a problem and that for demographic, labour market, economic reasons, Scotland needs migrants. That's the present Scottish Government and its predecessor have agreed upon that. Scottish Government European papers have indicated that they are in favour of a social dimension, which the Conservative Party tends to, well, it is not happy about. Let's just put it that way. There's the whole question of whether Scotland could adopt a distinct position in these negotiations or whether it just goes along with the United Kingdom. There were negotiations last year about justice and home affairs where the Scottish Government started out by seeming to have a different position but eventually fell in behind the UK position. But if Scotland does have a different position, what do you do about it? Does Scotland have a different vision of Europe generally from that of the present UK government? Then there's the question of what the role of Scotland would be in these negotiations. The Scottish Government and this Parliament, what role would they would have there? Because whereas the Scottish Government is represented in the UK delegation to the Council of Ministers on a number of matters, it's not quite clear what the devolved administration's role would be in constitutional negotiations. They certainly don't have the same position that they have in regular policy matters, and that's something that would have to be resolved fairly quickly. I don't know what the discussions are. I'm talking to people in government next week and may know more. But it is important that the devolved administrations should have a place there. And finally, there's the question of public engagement, informing the general public about what is going on here. We've got the experience in Scotland here of the referendum where there was a massive public debate and a huge degree of engagement, and it would be really important to try and build on that experience to get genuine information and engagement of the general public to carry them along with whatever the decision might be.
Thank you. Dr. Dunn.
Thanks, Convener. Just to briefly, I guess, add on to what Mike said, I think it is tremendously uncertain at the moment. So everything that we're going to say this morning is caveated and hedged because we don't know precisely what the set of demands might be, what the negotiation strategy might be. Picking through various speeches, statements, manifestos, and so on from the Prime Minister and from the Conservative Party, I've kind of, and sort of in my written evidence as well, focused in on 4 areas that seem to be of concern. I think Mike mentioned at least 3 of them, possibly actually all 4 of them. One is the issue of EU migrant workers coming to the UK and what their kind of access to benefits system, the welfare system is. To me, that's the kind of main part of the meal, and the rest is sort of seems to be garnish on the side. To various degrees, quite symbolic, I think, a lot of these garnishes, one of which, of course, is the phrase ever closer union. We've heard quite a lot from the Prime Minister, but other ministers too, the Foreign Secretary, that we'd like an opt-out or some sort of revisiting of the phrase ever closer union. And maybe that's something we can discuss. I'm still not entirely clear what that would actually mean. It's part of the preamble of the treaty. It doesn't have any direct legal effect. Actually was inserted into the treaty in its new form by a Conservative government at Maastricht, specifically to guard against what was seen to be a sort of centralising, or the fear of a centralising Brussels bureaucracy. They changed ever closer union to ever closer union amongst the peoples of Europe as opposed to the states and so on. So that seems to be one of the garnishes on the side. Then the Prime Minister's also talked about strengthening the role of national parliaments to be able to block European legislation. Now that would build on a system which already exists, the so-called yellow and orange card system, which is little used but does exist. So there's the possibility for additional power for national parliaments there somehow. Then there's the issue of Eurozone voting, and as Mike was alluding to, the idea that a block of Eurozone members might vote in a certain way according to their interests, and the non-Eurozone members might end up sort of almost permanently disadvantaged. There's precedent around the European Banking Authority and the way that was set up to look at sort of double majorities for that, although if you wanted to change the system of voting on the single market, that would require very significant treaty amendment, and I think that would be near impossible, although you never say never. So to me, they're the kind of 4 areas. It's migration, ever closer union, stronger role for national parliaments, and this issue of making sure Eurozone members can't outvote non-Eurozone members on a sort of systematic basis to pursue their interests. Then we've got to think about the mechanisms through which any change, any of those changes might be delivered. And I think we can think of this on a sliding scale from the less difficult to the more difficult. The least difficult thing to do is to amend your own domestic legislation, that is, to do things differently at home. And I dare say in a lot of the issues around sort of welfare and so on, things could be done differently at home. Whether that's minimum wage, whether that's tighter restrictions on advertising, jobs only abroad, so to speak, or offshore, whether it's pushing the envelope a little bit more on what we consider to be a job seeker for EU purposes. There's things that could potentially be done differently at home. That's the easiest, in a sense, thing to do. The next easiest, or the next most difficult, I suppose, thing to do is to seek legislative change in Europe. So not the treaties, but you change directives and regulations that govern free movement of citizens and free movement of people. And that would require, obviously, to get the consent of the Parliament, and it would require a majority, qualified majority of votes in the Council. So a higher threshold, you'd have to negotiate, you'd have to build a coalition. And then the most difficult way to do this, the highest burden, the highest barrier, is treaty change. And I think from previous inquiries around the white paper, the committee is well aware of how difficult treaty change is and the different ways it could be done. I dread to mention Article 48 again, but that's where we would have to look if we were going to talk about treaty change. Then just come into the issue of Scotland's interests in particular. I think the First Minister in her speech this week made it clear that it wouldn't have been a Scottish Government priority to pursue a referendum, and actually I thought took quite a strong stance actually on what Europe means to her and what Europe means to a lot of people. And in terms of her discussion in that speech of the need for movement forward on the digital single market, the single market in services, these are things that could be accomplished. They don't need treaty reform, they just need ongoing work, coalition building and so on in Brussels to pass new legislation and to pass new laws. What I thought was interesting in that, in terms of the Scottish dimension of this, is welfare. If we imagine hypothetically that there will be changes somewhere down the road to, for example, the benefits that EU migrant workers or job seekers can claim in the UK, there's then a question of whether or not Scotland could treat those same people differently if they lived and worked here. And that brings us quite squarely to the provisions of the Smith Commission. So I think there's linkages here. The way I read that at the moment, the way I read the Smith Commission, which is by no means the definitive reading of it, if a Scottish government in the future wanted to give different benefits to EU migrants here, that were effectively denied to them for a certain period of time, 4 years has been mentioned by the Prime Minister, I think there'd need to be an amendment to the current draft legislation around Smith. Smith allows for the creation of new benefits in devolved areas. It allows for the top-up of non-devolved benefits. But this would be an issue of actually allowing access to benefits to people who in the UK system wouldn't have that access for at least a certain number of years. And to me, that's qualitatively different. So there could be a specific Scottish interest there, although this is all obviously caveated and hedged because we don't know what the Prime Minister is going to actually ask for. The last thing I'd say in terms of Scotland being able to pursue its interests in this particular area, I think the intergovernmental system, the JMC machinery, is certainly the hidden wiring, so to speak, of this. There is a push at the moment, and again, this is partly a consequence of Smith, to strengthen the intergovernmental relations system and to strengthen the concordates, to turn the JMC from less of a kind of talking shop into a forum where actual deliberation and decision-making takes place. I'm not sure whether those changes will be done quickly enough or be received positively enough by the UK government to make a difference to these negotiations that are going to happen over the coming months and years, but that's something to be watched as it evolves. Other than that, I think the public forum, the public engagement, I think it would be very welcome if we have Scottish ministers and Scottish opposition politicians as an added voice, so to speak, in presumably the Yes campaign to stay in the European Union. I think that's a healthy thing. But I think an awful lot of the interests that the Scottish Government might wish to pursue will have to be done through sort of public pressure and an attempt to raise issues and raise awareness. Because as far as I can see it, the issues that the Prime Minister seems likely to push on really don't touch particularly on devolved competences, so it's hard to see a formal mechanism other than persuasion through the JMC system and so on, that those interests could be pursued. So I think I'll just leave it. Oh, very last thing I'd say is obviously the issue of the double lock. which has come up. I mean, in terms of how can Scotland secure its interests, if Scotland effectively has a veto on whether or not the UK can leave, and Wales and Northern Ireland effectively have a veto, then I suppose you could argue their interests would be secured because they just, whichever way they voted would be the outcome. I've written in my evidence that I'm not in favour of that system, which I think should be more accurately called a quadruple lock, really, not a double lock, because it's giving a right to four constituent units of the country to block an exit. And I've set out the reasons why I wouldn't be in favour of that proposal, but obviously it's an issue in the air, and it's a position that the First Minister has taken that would allow Scottish interests to be secured.
Thank you very much. Really detailed information and very different information from all of you. Before I move to opening questions, I just wanted to draw the committee's attention to the written evidence we've had from Dr Eve Hepburn, who's not been able to join us this morning. She's unwell and we send her our best wishes for a speedy recovery. But I wish to just draw committee's attention to Eve's written evidence, which is takes a very, very strong lines on the migration and immigration aspect of this whole debate. Open questions. Jamie McGregor.
Thanks very much. Well, the Prime Minister has consistently said that he is looking for reforms which would benefit not just the UK, but other countries in the EU as well. And he also spoke about the different preferences of different countries within the EU. I mean, for example, Germany looks after our car industry. France is very keen on supporting her culture. The UK, I think one of the most particular things is the financial services industry, which of course is vital for Scotland as well, and Edinburgh particularly. So I suppose my question, I noticed in Mr Keneally that you said it would be useful if the Scottish Government could be clearer about what, if any, distinct and specific interests Scotland has in this process, as opposed to repeatedly calling for a multiple veto lock. And then you go on to say, for the Scottish Parliament to be able to effectively scrutinise the performance of the Scottish Government in this area, it would be useful if the Cabinet Secretary could explain clearly what the objectives being pursued are and via what mechanisms they are being pursued. So I suppose my question to you is, there are some things, like, for example, everybody seems to complain about the visit to Strasbourg as being a waste of money. But that is going to be very difficult to change, as far as I can see, because it's such a sort of basic part of the treaty in the first place, which was insisted upon by the French. And I don't know if that's something that could be... But you talked about moving directives. And I mean, is it, in your view, possible for the UK and for Scotland to do something about supporting the financial services industry, which really would be a reform that would matter to this country and Scotland in particular?
Is that to me?
Yes.
Yeah,
and I mean, could you expand a little bit too on what you said about the Cabinet Secretary making it clear what Scotland actually wanted?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think just from the principle of accountability, I think it would be useful if... It's difficult to hold somebody to account for something if you don't know what their aims are and you don't know what their objectives are. So, I mean, all I'm saying simply in the evidence is that it would be helpful if we could have as clear a statement as possible as to what the aims are. But that would be true of the UK government, I would say, at the moment, as well as the Scottish government. And I think, the First Minister's speech this week, obviously my evidence was written before that was given, so I didn't have sight of it, went some way. I actually thought there was quite a clear statement there that, we wouldn't be having this referendum if it was up to us. We don't think it's a priority, but given that it is, here's what we think about it. And we don't think, for instance, that migration is the key issue. We wouldn't be making this a priority and so on. We're more concerned with pushing forward on a digital single market, a single market in services and so on, cooperation in energy and so on. All of which could be done through the kind of, if you want, the normal business of Brussels. It doesn't require us to sort of stop and renegotiate anything. So I think we've gone some way this week into seeing, what potentially the interests of the Scottish Government as distinct from, or the interests of Scotland as distinct from the rest of the UK might be in these negotiations. I mean, in terms of specifically, you asked about, say, sort of financial regulation. I mean, I think, again, piecing together statements and speeches, and you know, it's fair enough. You don't publish as a government. You don't publish your entire negotiating strategy up front. That would be a rather bizarre thing to do. So we're all working, trying to sort of piece together different statements and speeches and paragraphs from things here and there. But in terms of financial services and financial regulation, it seems to be that the concern is that Eurozone member states might, for instance, do things that are in their interests, which possibly aren't in the interests of the non-Eurozone states. And so what I've seen is a suggestion from the UK government that we need to move to a system in that area where we have basically a double majority system. So you have to have a majority or qualified majority of Eurozone members, but you also have to have a majority of non-Eurozone members to move business forward so that one can't outvote the other. So if we want to move forward on that, you see, that would be, to me, something which would require treaty change. You were asking, for instance, if you could do this through directives. I think if you really wanted to hardwire a different mechanism of voting in the Council, to govern these sort of areas, you'd have to be looking to the treaty to do that. There's precedent for it, I think, now. You know, that the other member states have shown a willingness to have this kind of double majority system around the European Banking Authority, which was set up. So the precedent seems to be there. I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm just saying that I think to really hardwire a change in voting in the Council, you'd really need to look at treaty change.
It's interesting what you say about the Eurozone and the non-Eurozone, because it appears to me that you know, if the Prime Minister has allies, I mean, some of them are, well, there's the Dutch, but there's the Finns, the Danes and the Swedes, who I think are all outside the Eurozone, aren't they? Certainly the Swedes and the Danes are. You know, that they seem to be coming on as allies for reform, I would say. Whereas for some of them have probably, you know, are still to look at this and see what possible reforms there could be which might benefit the whole of the EU. Do you think that this is a debate that has to go on within the other EU countries in order to get a proper perspective on it?
Yeah, I suspect so. I mean, first of all, let me just be very clear. I'm not suggesting that the UK government is going to Brussels with absolutely no friends to talk to on these issues at all. I mean, we've already heard statements from, I think, the German government and, as you said, the Dutch government around particularly the area of welfare and access to the benefit system of their countries for EU migrant workers. So we're not pushing on, I don't think the UK government will be pushing on entirely closed doors on all of these fronts. But yes, there'll have to be a process, presumably, of building up alliances and support for whatever the specific lines that the UK government wishes to pursue are. And in terms of, for instance, there are other non-Eurozone members who probably would be interested at least in having a conversation about whether we need to look more closely at voting rules. My expectation is that the debate that we're about to have in this country about our membership will have a knock-on effect in other states. I mean, Mike mentioned in his opening statement that one of the dangers of opening the treaties is, well, everybody comes forward with things that they don't like about the European Union. And it's kind of politically difficult to imagine that the other 27 states would say, OK, let's open up the treaties and we'll just do it for you and we'll just do it to address your grievances. That, to me, is it's theoretically possible, but it doesn't seem politically very imaginable. So I would imagine our debate would trigger discussion and already is triggering discussions in other member states about where they'd like to see reform. So yes, I think is the very short answer to your question. Yes.
Thank you.
Mr Frost, have you got a bit of an insight in just the conversation that's gone on there?
Well, thank you. Just a couple of points, perhaps. I agree with a lot of what's been said, but perhaps just on this question of allies. I guess, you know, what we've seen happen, I think, in the EU in the last month, really, is that the British problem, probably before our election, was a kind of second-order issue for most in the EU. They could see it coming, but it wasn't yet live. Since the election, it now is live, and I think it's now regarded as a first-order problem on the same level as the Eurozone and Greece and so on collectively. So I'm absolutely confident everybody is thinking very hard about this. And actually, they have been for some time. And you know, I think one of the useful things about the Prime Minister's agenda, as we understand it at the moment, is that it is designed to tap into sympathy around the EU. There actually is quite a lot of sympathy for greater role for national parliaments, for more liberal economic reform in some places, for more openness, more trade, and so on, particularly across Northern Europe. That's probably quite a widespread opinion. Now, will they want to sort of spend a lot of effort writing it into treaties is different, but I think there's definitely a constituency there to move some of this forward that we, should be tapping into if we want this to succeed.
Thank you. I've got Hans-Ala.
Thank you, and good morning, gentlemen. Professor Keating, you mentioned migration in passing, and also you've mentioned benefits as well. Now, the First Minister's later stall in which she's suggested that immigration perhaps might not be that high up in her agenda. However, nevertheless, immigration is an issue, migration is an issue, and what would you think would happen if we tried to pursue this separately from the United Kingdom while still being a part of the UK?
Well, it is entirely possible for Scotland to have a more welcoming attitude to migrants within Europe, because neither Scotland nor the UK government control that issue. So it's simply a matter of how welcome you are, what opportunities you provide for migrants, what benefits there are available. There's a certain amount that Scotland could do and is doing to realise a more welcoming attitude to migration, thinking about housing policy, education policy, health policy. The competences that it controls can be used to integrate migrants better, to anchor them better and provide the kind of support that migrants need. The other issue that Dan mentioned, and which is mentioned in Eve's paper, is about what discretion there would be providing different kinds of welfare benefits. And I think Eve raises a really important point there. But Dan is right that we don't quite know what's going to come out of Smith. But at the margin, at least, one can imagine that there would be a more generous attitude towards social entitlements of various sorts in Scotland than there would be in England. Recognising that migrants make a net contribution to taxation. That's the point. That is being demonstrated on numerous occasions. So it's not as though we're giving something away. It's recognising the contribution they're making. It might be important then that Scotland would be able to get the tax benefits, the tax payments that these people are making, rather than that going to London. But that is also on the agenda of Smith, and the income tax receipts will come to Scotland following the Smith recommendation. So I wouldn't see this being a major issue or affecting the flow of migrants in a big way, but at the margin that could be quite significant, and it's something that Scotland could do a little bit differently.
Okay, thank you.
Adam Ingram.
Thanks very much, Convener. I just wanted to pick up on Mr Frost's comment that the Prime Minister's objective is to secure EU membership. It seems to me to be a funny way of going about it by focusing on immigration and the free movement of labour, which is surely a fundamental part of membership of the European Union and would require treaty change if there was anything to be substantive to be done about it. Now, I'd just like to tease out your own thoughts with regards to what actually could be done in terms of altering the current arrangements for the free movement of labour to satisfy, on the one hand, what the Prime Minister's political objectives are, which I assume are to deal with the Eurosceptics and the UKIP kind of approach on the one hand, but on the other wouldn't require a treaty change which other countries wouldn't entertain.
Thank you. I'll do my best, and as I said before, it's a personal view I'm giving you here based on the work I've done on the single market and so on over the years. I mean, it looks as if the Prime Minister and the UK government have shied away at the moment from some of the more ambitious attempts to constrain free movement and really attacking the kind of fundamental principle of it as one of the four freedoms. It doesn't look as if that's their objective at the moment anyway. And so we have this debate about welfare and essentially issues at the margin around free movement. And I'm not really, an expert in that particular aspect of the single market, but it does seem to me possible to amend some of the rules around free movement through secondary legislation, if there's a political consensus around this, without fundamentally attacking the principle. And, the analogy I would draw from an area I know a bit better, which is free movement of goods and free trade, is that a few years back, 10 or 15 years back, there was a direction of sort of court opinion and legislation which was going in the direction of saying virtually any difference between a member states' kind of terms of trade, like opening hours of shops or something like that, was a disguised restriction on trade because it made it more difficult for non-members to trade in. And if that had been pursued, you would have seen virtually every difference sort of eliminated over time. And implicitly and a bit explicitly, member states, the court and others said, hang on a minute, we don't really intend to go that far. We're not sort of obsessive about implementing this principle right down to the very furthest limit. And so to me, that's a kind of parallel for free movement. It is possible to take a sort of pragmatic view at the margins about how you implement this principle without critiquing the basic way it works. And it seems to me that's what the government is trying to do. And I think it's been done before in other areas without hitting the single market as such.
I suppose the question I would have for Professor Keating and Dr. Keneally would be, would that satisfy what we see as a political opposition to the EU and to the free movement of labour within the EU? Or have we opened a Pandora's box here?
I suspect it wouldn't, but we've got a window of opportunity here, which may be one reason why the government seems to be wanting to get the referendum over earlier rather than later, possibly 2016 rather than 2017, in which David Cameron has got a political momentum because of his unexpected election victory. He's got a majority in Parliament, albeit a small one. He's got the attention of other member states. He's started talking to them, and they've started talking to him, which was not the case over the last 2 years. Relationships have really deteriorated. The UK has been regarded as an awkward partner by the other member states. Now they're engaged in the debate. They're elaborating an agenda which seems to be about incremental reform. They're opening up the question from beyond the UK getting powers back to what can be done to reform the EU as a whole. And public opinion is turning because it's more pro-European. In recent months, the polls have been turning. That could easily disappear, and we could get a return of the strong Eurosceptic tendency. There's nothing that will satisfy UKIP short of withdrawal. Within the Conservative Party, there's a Eurosceptic wing, which is also in favour of withdrawal, but they're not very vocal at the moment. So this is an opportunity within the next few months to get that right and get a package that can be taken through a referendum. But if it drags on for 2 years, and I think it could all fall apart. And certainly, what the government is talking about at the moment will not satisfy the die-hard Eurosceptics. If you want out, then you're not interested in these rather small changes.
I would agree with most of what Mike said. I mean, I think there's just, specifically about the issue of free movement and this issue of access to the welfare system. And I think the sort of the background of this seems to be the court, the European Court of Justice, has been on a little bit of a journey, I would argue, at least of late, where after years of being really quite expansive in its rulings on what the rights of EU citizenship were, they've just slowly started to to pull back on that a little bit. They've gone from having a bit of a tin ear on it to being a little bit more politically attuned, perhaps. And the so-called, the German benefits tourism case from last year, the Dano case, was something which got a lot of high profile in that regard. I think what we need to understand crucially is this is the key relationship between EU legislation, the EU treaties, and the court. And without knowing specifically what the Prime Minister may wish to or not wish to pursue, amending legislation, if that EU legislation, if it's underpinned by a provision in the treaty, would still give the European Court the right to come in at some point in the future and say, well, we don't accept that amendment. We don't consider that legal. That violates the treaty. And so if we look in the treaties at the provisions around equal non-discrimination and equal access and so on for EU workers, but also for job seekers, then change in the directive or change in the regulation might buy you a little bit of time potentially. But if you change it in a way that doesn't satisfy the European Court, and you haven't changed the treaty, they will eventually, someone will take a case to them, they will come back to you and say, well, that's no good, and you're back to square one. So there's an interaction between the legislation and the treaties, and the role of the court in that is really significant. One thing that could be done, for instance, with the status quo, though we wouldn't need any real change, excuse me, is the issue of transition controls. And I think if we're thinking about potential, a package of reforms that can be sold, if we just think about it purely politically for a minute, a package of reforms that can be sold as serious change. This idea of transition controls, so a new member state joins and for a number of years or until its GDP is at a certain level of average wages are at a certain level, free movement doesn't kick in. You could do that through the next accession treaty. You wouldn't need to change the European Union treaties if you could get, well, you wouldn't even need to get agreement because accession of new member states is done through unanimity. So the UK could seek to win more people in Europe around to that idea of transition controls, but actually it could exercise vetoes on new membership if it wasn't happy with the terms. So there are some things that could be done. I only mention that because it has been specifically mentioned by the Prime Minister, this idea of transition controls. That could be done as is. But elsewhere, when you get into the issue of welfare, the interaction between the directives and the treaties gets really, really complicated.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Rod.
Just kind of following on from that panel, the other 27 member states, they're trying to protect their citizens in relation to welfare benefits. Apart from kind of litigation in the European Court of Justice, what other practical steps can they take if they want to oppose some of the moves that might take place here?
That's the end of the question.
Sorry, did you not hear?
I didn't catch the middle.
No,
Yeah.
Basically, for the other 27 member states, apart from obviously going to the European Court of Justice, or maybe that would be an important part, what other steps can they take to try and protect the interests of their citizens against the adverse consequences of kind of welfare changes in the UK?
Well, that would be the principal mechanism, trying to think off the top of my head. I mean, they could simply block whatever proposals come forward from the UK if they don't like them. I mean, if you have to change a directive or pass a new one, you'd need a majority in the Parliament, you'd need a qualified majority in the Council. So if enough of them didn't like it, they could simply kill it dead at that point. If it was a change that needed to be underpinned by treaty change, for instance, they'd all have a veto on that because that would be unanimity, so they could stop it that way. But if, for instance, again, I'm trying to imagine scenarios, if they agreed to something and then they didn't like the way that it was potentially playing out in reality after the directive had been amended, short of going to the court or one of their citizens going to the court to challenge the UK government, I can't think of another mechanism. But that doesn't mean there isn't one. It just means I can't think of it.
At the present time, any of the 27 member states, what their view is on kind of proposed welfare changes? Have any of these 27 governments expressed vocally views on the issues?
Well, the Dutch government and the German government have expressed some concern about welfare. There was this decision that Dan referred to, it was a Romanian woman was denied welfare benefits in Germany. This was upheld by the court. Those have been the main cases. And then some people in Spain are unhappy about the health benefits that British citizens are drawing on the costas, which is a very substantial amount of money. So if Britain starts trying to restrict things, there would certainly be reciprocal action against British citizens elsewhere.
Just add on that I think this is one of these areas where kind of member states are only now tuning in to the specifics of what the UK has been asking. The debate's been quite highly political, and in the next few months that's going to change. And I think, you know, there is a degree of understanding, is my impression, of the fact that where you have different welfare systems in different countries, they generate different incentives and outcomes. And the fact that the UK has got a sort of non-contributory system and in-work benefit system is not the same as some of the others. That does generate you know, different degrees of access to benefits at different times for migrants to different member states. And I think there is a bit of understanding that is a technical problem that, you know, if it's generating political problems for member states, does need to be addressed. You know, is there sympathy for a significant attack on free movement? No, I doubt it very much.
Okay. Separate question. Do you have a view as to the pros and cons of going early or late in terms of a referendum on the outcome of these negotiations?
Well, ideally there should be a proper debate about this, and the public should be informed, and it just strikes me that a year may not be enough for that. Secondly, if the idea is to have a fundamental change in the relationship between the UK and the EU, which was the language that was used last year, that would require quite a bit of time. But things seem to have changed very rapidly since the election. And the idea now seems to be to have rather minor changes. What is reminded even of Harold Wilson, I remember this back in 1975, although the Eurosceptics are on the lookout for that, when very minor changes were put through, and then there was a referendum. That's probably going to happen. It would be, in many ways, a pity not to have a debate about the UK's relationship with the European Union in general, whatever the outcome is, to decide whether we want to be in or out, because we've never made up our minds in 40 years, to really have a big public debate. I would like to see that happen, whatever the outcome would be, because then the outcome would be legitimate. It would be informed, and the referendum would resolve things for a very long period of time. But I suspect we're not going to have that. I suspect we're going to have something that's done very quickly, in which the UK will probably vote to stay in, but not with the conviction that it might have if there was a proper and informed debate.
Yeah. Anybody else commenting?
Sorry, thanks. I would agree that, yeah, the longer would be the better. I think this is a complicated issue, and I think it needs, as Mike said, a longer and more informed debate. What I would hope is that is recast as slightly more of a dialogue. I think the stomach for the longer debate might depend on how it's framed and what the tone is of it politically. And if it's the UK in a dialogue with Europe about reforming the European Union for the benefit of everybody, where other interests are brought in and so on, then I think the public may have more of an appetite for a longer debate, as opposed to if it's presented as this is a battle with Europe, in which case if that's going to be the way it's pitched, probably better to get it over with quickly rather than let it carry on and sow further seeds of resentment, if it's pitched as a fight, you know, between us and them.
What about the impact of domestic politics, for example, in Germany on the timetable? Possibility of agreeing something with Merkel, for example, that might not be available for a new German Chancellor?
Yes, I think 2016 is one of the windows of opportunity when there are not elections in the major European countries. I can't remember who's voting when, but I know France and Germany are voting in 2017, and Spain is voting this year, and so on. So 2016 might be an opportunity in the electoral calendar to do it, which would be another reason for having it next year. 2017, then there are elections in France and Germany, and domestic politics would then put a huge amount of pressure on the leaders of those countries, and it could make life difficult.
And just to add, I mean, I don't have a view really on the date. I think you could see arguments in both directions, and I think a lot depends on, you know, how the negotiation actually goes and how long it takes. But from the point of view of relevant factors that affect timing, the other one, apart from national elections, of course, the UK's own EU presidency in the second half of 2017. And, you know, I'm guessing, but I can imagine that, you know, it could be awkward for the UK government to be holding a referendum and running the presidency at the same time. That may be a factor in the planning, and we know for sure that is going to happen then.
Thank you.
Dr Keneally touched on something that I feel is a very, very fundamental importance, and it's about the tone of this debate. And I mean, commentators for me have, you know, it's been distilled down to these two things: welfare and migration, immigration. And the migration, immigration thing has been conflated, I think, you know, possibly deliberately to create an issue that is possibly not there. But it's the tone of the debate that I'm really interested in. And for me, if we're having a debate on Europe, which we are, that debate should be much wider than just those two distilled points. It should be about the type of Europe which we want to be citizens of. It has to be about, you know, the support that we give to people who risk their life coming across the Mediterranean. It should be the support we give to people, and especially young people, to have the best opportunities they have in whatever part of the EU that they decide to take their education or their work or their lifetime experience to. And if we forget some of those key fundamentals of the social contract, as it was called many years ago, of the EU, and just distill it down to, you know, a couple of, you know, points and some numbers, actually does not us, you know, an injustice, but also the actual foundation of the European Union, an injustice. And I wonder if you've got any comments. I know you're all political scientists and you've all got, you know, experience in, and Dr. Dan, we so remember Article 48, 49 and Article 50. We are probably the most educated committee in the world on those articles. But for me, they don't mean as much unless people are at the heart of that. And whether it's a Europe that underpins everything that it does in the ECHR with domestic human rights legislation in national parliaments, that's the things that really matter. And if we can, you know, have a debate that's got that tone, I wonder if you could, you know, give me your impressions on, you know, that type of debate. And is that the debate we should be having, or have I got it completely wrong?
I think that's absolutely right, which is why I said it would be useful in this country to have a debate about Europe and what kind of Europe we want, not just whether we want to be in or out, or whether we want to opt out of the bits of it that we don't like. Euroscepticism is on the rise everywhere in Europe because of the crisis, but in most other countries it's about the kind of policies that come from Europe. It's not the principle of Europe itself. Apart from the right-wing populist parties, but the mainstream parties, it's what we're getting from Europe. This, the new parties, the Syriza and the Podemos and these kinds of parties, they're not anti-European, they're anti this particular European policy mix that we're getting. And that's an important debate to have. You mentioned the migrant crisis in the Mediterranean, and Europe's abject failure to respond to that. Which is exactly the sort of thing that Europe could do. The broader question of migration and how Europe can handle that. There's the question of austerity and unemployment, particularly amongst young people. So there is another European reform agenda, which is about how we can address these deficiencies in Europe to cope with these big problems. And it would be important to have that side of the argument there as well. And the danger here, as Dan said, this becomes an argument about us and them. That's extremely dangerous, but an argument about what kind of Europe we should have, because there are different visions of Europe here. I think that would be extremely helpful. And that's the kind of argument, if you go to other European countries, they have, even though they grumble about Europe the whole time. They don't say it's them doing things to us. It's about what kind of Europe we want. We don't like the way that Europe is going, whereas in this country, it's always they're doing things to us. And I think if that were reframed, not only would that be healthy for the democratic deliberation, but it would also enhance British influence in Europe if we talked about what we can do for Europe as well as what they're doing to us.
Yeah. Dr. Dan.
I agree with you, Convener, but my inner realist is sceptical that I don't think, however this debate is conducted, that, and I know that you didn't say this, but I'm just saying, however this debate is conducted, I don't think the sort of culture of the way the UK interacts with Europe is going to be transformed. I think if that's what we hope, then we're setting the bar, unfortunately, too high. Maybe that's just me being overly cynical. But what I think it could do is potentially just take the edge off that kind of them and us mentality party, look what's being done to us by Europe. And that will depend, I agree with you, on how the tone of the debate progresses, but also how the campaigns might be structured. I mean, it's easy, you know, we're now hearing, for example, that there won't be potentially a unified yes campaign. There'll be multiple campaigns that kind of talk to each other and broadly push in one direction. And then who the spokespeople for those campaigns are and what kind of tone they set will be really important. So in a sense, I think the politicians across the scale, across the spectrum, need to lead kind of by example on this point. I doubt politicians of certain parties will do that, because they're obviously vehemently opposed to the EU, and they present an image of the EU which is very loosely connected, if at all, to reality. I don't think that's going to change, but I think the other parties, that's why I said at the beginning, I would see Scottish participation in this debate. The fact that we have a Europe minister in Scotland, a shadow Europe minister in Scotland, who can be spokespeople for that positive campaign that you're talking about, I think that's a good thing. And that's not about division within the country. That's not about Scottish ministers and MSPs treading on terrain that they shouldn't. That's about making the case which matters to all of us in our communities and so on. So I agree with you. The other last thing I'd say about this is, and this has been a great disappointment of mine for a number of years with the Europe debate, is we don't ever seem to put it in the context, not really, not explicitly, of Britain's role in the world. If we decide to leave the European Union on the back of a rather narrow and potentially nasty discussion about migration and access to benefits, which, as Mike said, all of the evidence says EU citizens who come to work here are a net contributor to our economy. If we end up leaving the European Union because of that, that will be the single biggest foreign policy decision potentially since Suez. And to do it to not put that debate in that broader context of what country do we think we are in the world, how do we interact with our neighbours, how do we balance our historical connections with the Commonwealth, with our historical connections to Europe, with the transatlantic bridge, to not put it in that context, I think would be quite dangerous and a missed opportunity. So in addition to the people side of it, I'd like more discussion about, you know, what we see the future foreign policy of our country as.
Yeah, so you've just covered our committee, we're Europe and external affairs. So, Mr Frost, I think some comments.
just a couple of points on that, really. I mean, I certainly agree that, you know, when we get to the referendum, you know, I hope it is a real debate about everything that Europe offers, and you've mentioned quite a few of those things. I mean, I would add the single market and the single trade policy to that, and although estimates vary about, you know, how much wealth the single market generates for the UK since we joined, it's probably in the order of 5, 6, 7, 8% uplift to GDP. You know, for somebody on an average salary, that's about £1,500 a year, and most people think that's worth having. And I think when you put it in those terms, there's a very clear benefit that because we don't see it every day, we've kind of forgotten about it, but it is there, and we'd begin to lose it if we weren't part of it. Just one other comment, kind of picking up what colleagues have said. I think it's possible to be sometimes a bit self-critical of the UK and the way we attack these problems and of our debate here. And I always sort of jokingly called it Lawrence Stern syndrome when I was in the Foreign Office from his book, The Sentimental Journey, and the first line is, "They order these matters, I said, better in France." And I think it's this tendency to think that others always do it better. And you know, if you look at policy making around the Eurozone that the UK has not been involved in at all, I think it's hard to argue that's the kind of model of good policy making and domestic engagement either. So, you know, I think it is possible to be too self-critical about this. We all in Europe face problems in different ways, and I think what we're going to have to find in the next few years, whether it's through this renegotiation or other things, is a way of reconciling them and finding statuses of membership that we can all be comfortable with. And I think that's a lot of what this is about.
Thank you very much. Willie Coffey.
Thanks very much, Convener, and good morning to you. Could I ask you about what the UK government's negotiating position might be and how it might develop that? Do you see any evidence that the UK government at the moment, or plans to, embrace the Scottish, Welsh, Northern Ireland assemblies in terms of thinking about what to present to Europe as a case for remaining in Europe for the United Kingdom? Or do you see it very much as a case for the Conservative Party and what their issues are?
It's not quite clear to me. I'd say, just picking up David's last point there, that the UK, in fact, in Europe has historically been a rather effective operator. It's been rather good at negotiating and well focused. That's just in contrast with the rhetoric that seems to surround it. So that would give rise to some optimism. I don't know what the role of the devolved administrations is going to be. They'll certainly be consulted, but they were consulted over the balance of competences review, but they weren't involved in the decision-making process. And this would imply getting all the papers, being fully informed, being part of the working parties preparatory to negotiation meetings, Scottish ministers even participating the way that they do in the Council of Ministers. I don't know what the proposal is for that, but I haven't seen any evidence that there would be a full incorporation of the devolved administrations. But as I said at the outset, that's something that is important to get right very, very quickly before these negotiations start in earnest. We've just had rounds of preliminary discussions, but before these negotiations start in earnest, we'd want to know what the decision of the devolved administration is in the entire process.
Yeah, similarly, I've not, to my knowledge, there's been no formal briefings yet by the UK government to the devolved administrations on how the negotiation line is developing. I suppose we've got the JMC Europe on the 15th of June, I think, from memory. It's coming up. And that, to me, would be the, if we're going to move quickly on this and we're going to start to table things in the European Council this year, then that would be the moment to seek clarity on that. And hopefully the JMC has become a little bit more transparent over recent years, but there's still a lot of work to be done there, I would argue, to make it more transparent in terms of what goes on inside it and what the conclusions are. But that would be the moment to as Mike says, I think, clarify just exactly what the involvement would be. My understanding is that the permanent representative, the UK permanent representative in Brussels, is keen to ensure that devolved officers, devolved representations in Brussels are coordinated, are involved, are fully streamlined into this process. But of course that brings up the distinction between how officials interact versus how politicians interact, and they can be quite different. The sticking point may be at the ministerial level more so than it is at the official level. So it seems from what I've heard that at least in terms of the UK permanent representation in Brussels, there is a willingness to do this in an open and inclusive way. But the tone for that is obviously going to be set by the UK government ministers that are involved, and then on the other side, the Scottish government, Welsh government, and Northern Irish ministers. One thing that we almost shouldn't forget is that the devolved assemblies, the devolved administrations should and could work collectively on this. I know the First Minister met yesterday with the Welsh First Minister, and again, from what I'm hearing, there is a plan to not a sort of secret plan or anything, but a plan to coordinate amongst the devolves, because this is an important issue that they have distinct interests in. But as Mike said, I don't think any of us have heard anything yet to suggest that there's going to be a radically different type of interaction between the UK and the devolveds on this particular issue.
I guess I would distinguish relations between devolved governments and administrations and devolved parliaments, and I think there are different ways of dealing with them. Within governments and administrations, obviously JMCE is the formal basis for engagement. Like most cabinet committees, it's kind of to some extent dignified rather than efficient, and a lot of the kind of real interaction about policy takes place in different ways, and the Brussels interaction, as well as between the four capitals within the UK, will be an important part of that. So I wouldn't exaggerate the significance of JMCE in making it work between governments. I think all the administrations need to make an effort to collaborate, and I would imagine that's happening. I don't know, but I think it would be pretty essential. Parliamentary angle, I think, is different, and we haven't talked about it, but I imagine that, and again I don't know, but I would imagine the UK government's thinking about some way of involving the Europe committees of the Commons and of the Lords, and making sure they know to some extent what's going on in this renegotiation and how they're handling it. I wrote an essay, you may have seen it, for Open Europe back in February, where I said that I thought the government ought to give some consideration if they were doing that for the UK Parliament, they ought to think about how they did that with the Scottish Parliament and the other devolved parliaments as well. And I don't know whether that's a suggestion that's found any favour, but I would have thought it was pretty important to engage parliamentary opinion in a explicit way, as well as the government-to-government relations.
You see, ultimately the UK is going to go to the table with a set of requests, requirements, demands, if you like, X, Y, Z. How can that possibly be reconciled with, for example, on migration with the Scottish Government's position? You can't seriously present a UK position on that to Europe. It's going to be a Conservative Party position, in my view. How can you have both of those positions represented fairly to Europe? You can't.
Well, ultimately, I mean, there'll be. I mean, I don't want to start speculating on the future because we don't know what the demands or what the negotiating line of the UK government might be. But presumably, there will be opportunity to discuss and debate. But in political discussion and negotiation through the intergovernmental system, yet there's winners and losers sometimes. And I guess that's politics. That might be a very simple answer. But yeah, if there's divergent views, then there's a problem. And everything we know about the JMC machinery and the broader intergovernmental relations machinery is that it works least effectively when there is a divergence of interests. And, you know, there's a power asymmetry there at the end of the day. The UK government is the more powerful, of the two actors. And if the interests collide, then it's more likely than not that one is going to supersede the other. But in terms of restrictions on migration, again, I think what's likely to come forward, I said I didn't want to speculate, and here I go, is likely to be quite limited, targeted changes to access to benefit systems. It's not going to be some sort of blanket ban or restriction or cap on who can come here from Europe, because I think, as all of us have said explicitly or implicitly, that's just not going to fly. That's too contra to the founding principles of the EU. It'll be much more targeted around what people can claim, how long they have to be here before they can claim it. And then we come back to the issue of, well, how is Smith going to evolve? Because Smith could evolve in a certain way that would allow the Scottish government or the Scottish Parliament to do things differently, but not, as I said at the beginning, not, I don't think, based on its current language, but that can change.
And this arises all the time, of course, in relation to European issues through the Joint Ministerial Committee and the delegation to the Council of Ministers, where ultimately the UK government has the last word. The difference here is that it's not just devolved matters, it's non-devolved matters. Many of the issues with regard to migration are not devolved, but of the interest, nevertheless, have a particular interest for Scotland. So it would be important that Scotland should be represented not just in relation to devolved matters, but in relation to things that impact on Scotland in a particular way, even if they're reserved.
Could I just one wee final question on the possibility of treaty change? And I think some of the discussion suggested that if the changes proposed aren't substantial enough, they don't require treaty change. But if they do, if the changes are substantial enough and require treaty change, some of the member states will have to put that to their citizens in referenda. And is it likely then in those circumstances that, for example, Ireland, whose European minister did say that, did confirm that Ireland would have to have a referendum? Do you foresee the situation where, for example, the people of Ireland are being asked to vote on treaty change that benefits and possibly disadvantages themselves but benefits the UK? Can you see the people of Ireland supporting that?
Well, the Irish always vote twice. Once they're given a second chance. They're given a second chance. But if it's, there's two types of treaty change. One is giving the UK more opt-outs, and I don't think that's going to happen. But that was the initial tone. We'll opt out of more things. You can't opt out of things that are already part of the acquis. You cannot go in with this new treaty change. Never before countries been allowed to opt out. So it's more about doing things that affect the whole of the EU, and then that would have to be done in such a way you could sell it in the other member states as well. And that's something the government seems to have realised now. You can't just ask for special treatment for the UK because they're not going to give it to you. You've got to contribute to Europe as a whole and show that whatever you're doing has benefits for the other member states as well.
Dr. Dan, have you a view on that?
Well, whether it's possible, I don't know.
No, I do agree on that, and as Mike says, yes, they could always have a second vote on it. But I think, yeah, in terms of the welfare, in terms of possible welfare changes and access, there are things. A lot of this is incredibly definitional, and the issue. The issue is that the European courts, using the language in the treaties and the directives that exist that govern this area of EU law, can be very flexible on how they interpret, for instance, a job seeker. I think the exact phrase in the directive is if you're in the country, are looking for work and have a genuine chance of employment. Now, what does that mean? That's a very loose phrase in terms of how you interpret that. And the courts have chosen to interpret it quite expansively over the years. Similarly, you can't deny EU job seekers access to, quote, benefits linked to labour market participation, but you can deny them social assistance. So you can get into arguments in this area and discussions with European partners about, well, what is social assistance and what is a benefit linked to labour market participation. And what you could look to do is tighten up the definitions in those areas, for example. That would then apply equally across all member states, and potentially everybody would be seen to benefit a little bit from it. All countries might be able to benefit because they pay a little bit less out in welfare, but actually the workers that are moving around Europe actually might lose a little bit because they're able to take out less in welfare. So you could do it in a way that, as Mike was suggesting, is a bit more, it would give everybody a little bit of something. They could claim that there's been a success here. And we've heard from the Germans, we've heard from the Dutch, that there is a desire to try and tighten up on this area because we have had expansive court rulings in this area over the years that do stretch the definition of job seeker to what I would consider breaking point, to be honest. So we could try and tighten that up in a way that applies to everybody, so we wouldn't get into the situation that you described in your question.
Okay. Thank you.
On the question of treaty change itself, I mean, I wouldn't comment on the Irish specific case, but on the issue of do you need treaty change or not, I mean, I would personally be astonished if this renegotiation ended with an agreement by all the member states to a particular set of treaty changes that went to ratification. I just don't think that's going to happen for political reasons. At the same time, I think, it feels like the PM is going to need a bit more than a promise to change a few directives in detail down the line if it's going to kind of pass the credibility and referendum test. So, I suspect what we're going to end up with is a typical EU fudge where we kind of, the European Council commits to certain principles, makes a solemn declaration about it, agrees that when it gets at the next opportunity, these would go into the treaties. Meanwhile, we're all committed to them and tries to kind of deal with it that way. So it feels major, it feels solemn, there's a commitment to change the structure down the line, but at the same time doesn't require anybody to run the risk for a referendum in the short run. I mean, I'm speculating, clearly, but I wouldn't be surprised if it came out like that.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, we're really running up against our time scale here. I've got Anne and then a couple of supplementaries for both Jamie and Adam.
I'll be quick. Thanks, Convener. Just to keep you within the area of speculation, my apologies for doing that. Really, just to underline what are some of the implications of a no vote, what they might be for Scotland.
It is. Well, everyone's looking at me. I think being outside the single market, being outside the single trade policy, will be fundamentally disadvantageous to any bit of Europe. I mean, you gain from being part of a big market. If we're part of that. If we're not part of that, that would be significant, I would have thought, to prosperity of everyone in Scotland and in the UK. That's why I don't think we should be coming out of the single market. Quite apart from the fundamentals, you have to think about all the transitional costs, all the kind of reorganising things, all the kind of change of expectations of foreign investors and so on, different perceptions of a country. So I think those are the economic risks if we were to leave.
Well, if the UK were to withdraw from the EU, it would have to establish another trading relationship with the EU. It would have to put something in place, a regime, just to continue trading. It would be in a weak position negotiating with the EU, and the EU would be in a very strong position. If it wanted full market access, it would probably have to accept the rules of the single market as Norway does, without having a say in the making of that. So that could put itself in a very, very difficult position. Now, there is an alternative strategy, which is to diversify trade, to open up beyond Europe. So I'm not saying the UK could not survive outside Europe. Certainly it could, but would have to negotiate its own position within the global trading order. There's not just come out and then life continues. Something would have to be put in place of the European Union.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think potentially the economic consequences would be quite significant, and a lot would hinge, it is speculation, but a lot would hinge on, as both my colleagues have said, the relationship that we manage to then re-establish with the European Union, because I don't think anybody is suggesting we would want to be completely and totally cut loose entirely. I think the idea of a sort of Swiss-type multiple bilateral treaties is highly improbable. I think Europe have done this once and they don't particularly want to do it again. And as Mike says, if we end up in a situation like Norway, we accept an awful lot of the regulations and the provisions without having any say in them. And that would include provisions on the free movement of labour. So if that's going to be the big, if that's the big point, if that's the big issue that we're going to end up fighting about, a Norwegian relationship to the EU is not a way to resolve that. You almost end up worse off.
Thank you.
Thank you. I've got a quick supplementary, one from Jamie and then one from Adam.
Yes, I'll be as quick as I can. Professor Keating mentioned briefly the acquis, and David Frost mentioned fudge, which I think are two interesting things to do with Europe. Because if you take, for example, the fishing industry, the whole of the fishing industry in the North Sea is based on a derogation from the acquis, because the acquis says equal access to a common resource, but that's actually not what happens at all. And my point there is that nobody's changed the treaty to do that. There have been derogations for different nation states. Now, it seems to me that the Prime Minister certainly is moving away from demanding changes on social policy. He's more going for safeguarding national interests within, say, the non-Eurozone countries as against things being imposed by the Eurozone countries, and also giving greater powers to national parliaments, and i.e. a sort of lighter-style Europe without the great heaving hoof of authority coming down the whole time from Brussels. So in order to achieve that, I mean, the idea of derogations, which has been used before, could presumably be used again in other spheres outside the fishing industry.
Yes, indeed. The fishing thing took a very long time to negotiate. You know, it took decades, and the Spanish had a very strong interest in it. But apart from that, it was non-EU countries that the Scottish and the UK fishing industry was competing with. So it's not clear that could always be taken as a precedent. But yes, you're right. And the other thing that can be done is greater application of the principle of subsidiarity.
Big preference, for example, and subsidiarity,
yeah, exactly.
Which John Major, of course, was a great proponent of.
Indeed. And this has there have been attempts to apply it by saying that the EU could regulate with a light touch. There could be greater scope for variations, that the competition policy doesn't have to be as rigorous and rigid as it is applying in situations where there's not really a problem. Or cohesion policy, which still spends a lot of money now, mainly in Central and Eastern Europe. That doesn't have to be run so closely from Brussels. It can be decentralized. So I'd see quite a lot of scope for that, and scope for agreement across Europe, that maybe Brussels could do things in a much more decentralized way.
Thank you.
Okay, Adam.
And in that context, was not the contribution that the First Minister made earlier on this week very much in line with that kind of approach, where she was looking for maybe an easing of or more flexibility for member states to deal with issues. I think she mentioned issues like public health, for example. On the one hand, and on the other hand, in terms of making regulation a bit more proportional, and also to introduce subsidiarity. I'm thinking of the fisheries, for example. Is that not the way to go to engage across the board with our partners in Europe these kind of renegotiations? Would they not move away from the sort of confrontational aspect of it and really get to the substance of what needs to change in Europe and what reforms are required?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've not come across a mainstream UK politician who isn't calling for membership plus reform, and that sort of brings me back to where I started. It all depends what you mean by reform and how you intend to get there. And obviously, what the First Minister said yesterday is very much in the mainstream of that. Although I should probably obviously acknowledge that my official capacity, we're the plaintiff in the particular case she alluded to, so I probably shouldn't comment any further on that. But I guess, what, as she said at one point, we wouldn't have had a referendum, but now there is going to be a referendum, so that's what the debate is about. And I guess I might say, there might be other ways of pursuing reform, but there's now going to be a renegotiation, and the question is how do you get that best out of that and conduct it in the most constructive way? And I think that's probably the question going forward.
Sorry. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, just to briefly come back to Jamie's question on in terms of the derogations, for example. I mean, because you mentioned the strengthening of national parliaments, for example. Now, that's something to me. If you want to strengthen that beyond the current yellow-orange card system, then you have to do one or two things. You either have to get the Commission to basically say, we promise to, whenever a third of national parliaments object to something, we take the proposal off the table. That would be to strengthen the existing provision. You wouldn't need to do treaty change. You just have to get the Commission to effectively agree to a different way of working. But if you wanted to actually, again, hardwire a red card procedure, for instance, where a set of national parliaments at a sufficient number can actually say, no, we stop this dead, this proposal, it goes no further, then you have to change the protocol, which is at the back of the treaty, which deals with that issue. You can't, I don't see any other way that you can do that on the national parliament issue. And that's because that wouldn't be the UK seeking a derogation from something. That's seeking a material change to the way the European Union works.
Be another member state.
Yes, no, it might. But if you want to strengthen the way national parliaments can coordinate to block legislation, then that's not seeking to opt out from something. That's seeking to strengthen and reform an existing institutional mechanism. And that would mean you have to change the way that mechanism works, and that's written into the treaties, so you'd have to do that. It was just specifically on the national parliament point, but just as a final thing, just briefly, in terms of the articles of the treaty, if we look up the front of the treaty, articles 4, 5, and so on, these principles are hardwired in there already. The principle of conferred powers, of subsidiarity, of proportionality, the idea of the sort of clunking fist from Brussels. I mean, since 2005, under the REFIT programme, as it's called, which I always forget the acronym, regulatory fitness is what they call it, we've had over 600 regulations repealed by the European Union, and there's a new system in place now to do much more systemic checks about regulations before they're introduced. So I think the idea of the clunking regulatory fist of Brussels is sometimes a little bit oversold, and what a lot of this might be about actually is looking at the principles that are in the treaty around subsidiarity and proportionality and actually making them mean something in terms of how Brussels does its day-to-day business. That doesn't require treaty reform, as people have mentioned. That just requires that people take subsidiarity and proportionality more seriously when they're doing the day-to-day business of European Union policy making. It doesn't take treaty reform because the principles are there already.
Okay, we are absolutely up against our clock now. I've got one very, very quick question. We've strayed into, a lot of what ifs, a lot of speculation, some realism and some idealism, and hopefully some visionary stuff. But one thing we do know is about the franchise in the actual referendum. And very, very quickly, obviously, the Scottish Government, and I think many people across this Parliament, have called for the franchise to be extended to 16 and 17-year-olds and everyone who choose the UK as their home, in as much as they had the same rights in the Indie Ref, that they have the same rights in the EU referendum. Quick thoughts, please.
I'm going to balance idealism with realism for my final comment. Idealistically and somewhat personally, actually, on this, because my partner works at the university. He's German. He's been here for 6 or 7 years, won't be able to vote in this referendum, and is an encyclopedia of the EU and is passionate about it. And I consider that wrong. But that's my idealistic response. My realistic response is, ultimately, this is a matter for the UK government. It'll be put into the referendum bill. The Conservatives have a majority, so on this issue, it is really a matter for the Conservative Party. And the really hardcore bit of realism here is, I don't think it would, for other European countries, for instance, who might think we should extend the franchise, the last thing that those who are tilting towards the no side might want is to be told by other European states who gets to vote in the referendum. So whilst I don't necessarily agree with it on idealistic and principle grounds, I would probably just let it run its course and let the UK government decide.
We have a member, democratic member of this Parliament who won't be allowed to vote in that referendum either. Michael?
Yes, well, the franchise for the Scottish referendum was based upon the franchise for the Scottish Parliament. It was just taken, and that was based upon the existing local government franchise. So it wasn't as though they decided to do it, it was almost a default. And similarly, I think the default will be for this referendum, it will be the UK Parliament franchise. There is a question about opening it up to 16-year-olds. I think that's an idea whose time has come, and it will come generally. Whether you should introduce it just for this referendum, I don't know, but there's certainly a case for thinking about using this as an opportunity to extend the franchise to 16-year-olds.
Well, we're extending it to everything in Scotland. I think maybe the UK should just follow suit on that one. David?
Yeah, I mean, I don't really feel qualified to express a view, to be honest. It's a sort of political, constitutional question. You know, personally, I can see arguments in both directions. Feels like the argument's not quite closed yet. The bill's going through Parliament, and there'll be further discussion.
Excellent. Thank you very, very much. I think we've had a very, very interesting exchange this morning. I don't think this exchange will end at this point. If you've worked with this committee before, you know that we keep an eye on everything that's happening. Certainly this will be one. There's a keen interest across committee members. We're keen to hear from you as things unfold. If there's other opinions or ideas that you have, please feed that back to the committee. We'd be very keen to hear that, and also with any of your colleagues or interested parties out there who have got an opinion on this, we'd be very keen to hear that too. But thank you very much for being at committee this morning. And I now close this part of the committee and go into private session. Thank you.